Summer 1943 arrived in the Solomons with a humidity so thick it clung to every exposed surface of Henderson Field. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and the faint acrid tang of spent cordite from earlier skirmishes. American pilots, sweat-streaked and restless, leaned over their F4U Corsairs, inspecting the lines of the gull-wings that seemed almost grotesque to any eye trained on the sleek silhouettes of Japanese fighters. To the uninitiated, the Corsair looked more like a mechanical vulture than a warplane. Its inverted gull-wing, long fuselage, and stubby canopy creating an impression of awkwardness. Yet beneath the unusual form lay an engine that could roar through the sky with terrifying authority. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder powerhouse delivering over 2,000 horsepower, capable of propelling the aircraft past 400 miles per hour. Coupled with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each carrying more than 4,000 rounds of ammunition, the Corsair was a predator disguised in clumsy feathers. When the Japanese first encountered the aircraft over the Solomon Islands and later the Gilberts, they did not immediately sense its lethal potential. Pilots from the famed 4th Air Group, accustomed to the nimble Mitsubishi A6M0, chuckled at the sight of the American fighters taxiing along coral airstrips. "What are these brutes?" one pilot reportedly wrote in his war diary, captured post-war by Allied interrogators. "They are like the monsters of the old world, incapable of turning, slow to respond. Our Zeros will toy with them." The Corsair's size, its stubby canopy and heavy profile, invited mockery. Its gull-wing design, engineered to allow a shorter, stronger landing gear while accommodating the massive propeller, looked to the Japanese like a design flaw. Yet appearances were deceiving. US Marine pilots had flown Corsairs through rigorous training programs, executing dives, climbs, and deflection shooting drills, until every muscle memory was tuned to the aircraft's unique characteristics. These pilots understood that the Corsair's ungainly form belied its tactical advantage. The long nose allowed for concentrated firepower, the robust airframe could sustain hits that would cripple a Zero, and the double Wasp engine gave the aircraft a climb rate that, once mastered, permitted boom and zoom tactics few Japanese pilots had encountered in prior engagements. The first encounters were almost comical in their imbalance. Over the emerald waters near Guadalcanal, Corsairs from VMF 124 scrambled to intercept incoming Zero formations. The Japanese, seeing the unfamiliar silhouettes, instinctively assumed they could outmaneuver the heavy Americans. Early dogfights, however, revealed a painful truth. While inexperienced Corsair pilots struggled to adjust to the precise turning requirements of their aircraft, the Zeros, nimble and forgiving, danced in the sky with ease. Initial reports from Marine squadrons reflected the harsh learning curve. Several Corsairs were lost, not to superior firepower, but to over-aggressive attacks and misjudged deflection angles. Even so, every engagement carried lessons etched in metal and smoke. Debriefing reports from the 339th Fighter Squadron and 13th Fighter Command, later archived in the U.S. National Archives, detail the initial losses and the adjustments made. Pilots began abandoning the instinct to turn tightly with the Zero, instead climbing above, diving through, and exploiting the Corsair's superior speed and engine power. Boom and zoom tactics were born of necessity. Unlike the Zero, which excelled in low-speed maneuvering, the Corsair could dive from altitude, deliver a withering burst of fire, and climb back to safety. Each engagement was a conversation between mettle and skill, and slowly the narrative began to shift. Industrial context played an equally decisive role. The Corsair was not merely an aircraft, it was a product of the United States industrial war machine. Lockheed and Vought production lines, alongside Pratt and Whitney engine plants, were churning out hundreds of aircraft per month. By mid-1943, the US Navy and Marine Corps had already amassed squadrons equipped with Corsairs, each one supported by a vast logistics network delivering spare parts, ammunition, and trained mechanics. This industrial capacity meant that losses, while painful, were replaceable, and operational readiness remained high. In contrast, Japanese pilots faced a tightening bottleneck. Fuel shortages, maintenance difficulties, and the gradual attrition of experienced flyers threatened the sustainability of their air operations. Back in the cockpit, the psychological shift began quietly. Japanese airmen, initially amused, began noticing patterns. The Corsair could absorb multiple hits without catastrophic failure. Its pilot could execute vertical maneuvers that drew on engine power the Zero could not match. The American pilots, though still learning, were beginning to hit formations with devastating accuracy. One captured war diary entry noted the bewilderment of Japanese pilots during a sortie over Bougainville. "Their machine is large, but it comes down like lightning, and our Zeros fall before their guns. We had mocked them, now we fear them." By the close of 1943, the F4U Corsair had begun to shed its reputation as an awkward novelty. The first losses, the initial fumbling, were replaced by confidence, tactical innovation, and the realization that this ugly fighter possessed the tools to dominate the Pacific skies. The combination of raw power, firepower, climb performance, and industrial sustainability was turning what the Japanese had laughed at into a lethal adversary. Even the skeptics on the American side began to appreciate the aircraft. Pilots who had doubted the gull-wing design or the heavy machine gun loadout found themselves relying on its robust structure, the reassuring roar of the double Wasp engine, and the sting of its firepower. The Corsair was no longer a curiosity, it was a statement. The war in the Pacific was evolving, and the tools of victory were beginning to speak for themselves in the smoke-filled skies above the Solomons. By the end of the chapter, it was clear that the initial mockery was fading, replaced by grudging respect, and the first flickers of fear among Japanese pilots who had once laughed at the gull-wing. By late 1943, the F4U Corsair had moved from curiosity to a growing threat in the skies over the Central and South Pacific. The lessons of earlier engagements, the initial losses, the tactical mistakes, had been assimilated into doctrine. Marine and Navy pilots were beginning to exploit a critical advantage that the Japanese had underestimated, the Corsair's climb performance. While the Zero remained superior in low-speed dogfighting, the Corsair, powered by its Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine, could climb faster, higher, and with far greater stability under combat load. The difference was subtle to the untrained eye, but decisive in actual combat. Reports from the 339th Fighter Squadron, operating in coordination with Marine Corsair units, show the tactical shift in vivid detail. Pilots now sought altitude aggressively at the start of missions. From positions high above the Japanese formations, Corsairs could dive at 350 to 400 miles per hour, unleashing concentrated bursts of .50 caliber fire, then pull up sharply before the slower Zero could respond. In contrast to earlier encounters, where inexperienced pilots attempted to match the Zero in tight-turning fights, the new approach minimized vulnerability and maximized the aircraft's strengths. One debriefing report from October 1943 noted, "Engagements from above are favorable. The enemy's maneuverability cannot counter sustained fire from a dive. High-angle attacks are decisive." Japanese pilots quickly realized the implications. Diaries and post-war interrogation reports described the shock of facing an enemy who refused to engage on their terms. "They do not turn with us," a 4th Air Group pilot recorded in December 1943. "They dive from the sky like hawks, fire with accuracy, and vanish before we can close." The psychological impact was compounded by the Corsair's firepower. 6 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of piercing armor that had once been sufficient to withstand lighter 30 caliber rounds, could destroy a Zero with a single well-aimed volley. Experienced Japanese pilots, once confident in the agility and light structure of their aircraft, found themselves outgunned in the vertical plane. The mechanics of the advantage lay in physics as much as engineering. The double Wasp engine, supercharged to maintain power at altitude, allowed the Corsair to climb at rates exceeding 3,000 feet per minute with a full combat load, something the Zero, lightly armoured but optimised for low-altitude manoeuvring, could not match. Coupled with a reinforced airframe that withstood high-speed dives without flutter or loss of control, the Corsair transformed altitude into tactical currency. Marine pilots referred to it simply as taking the high road. It was a strategy that demanded discipline, patience, and an understanding of energy management. Never trade height for a turn, always maintain the option to disengage, and always strike from above. On the 18th of November 1943, during a sortie over Bougainville, VMF 124 engaged a formation of 16 Zeros, escorting bomb-laden Mitsubishi G4Ms. The Corsairs approached from 5,000 feet higher, diving in pairs, firing controlled bursts at the Zeros before climbing back to altitude. Reports indicate that 3 Zeros were destroyed almost immediately, 2 others damaged and forced to retreat, while the Corsairs suffered no losses. Debriefing notes emphasize the novelty of the tactic to the Japanese. Enemy uses height advantage, does not engage in turning dogfights. Firepower is overwhelming. Pilots report confusion and shock among Japanese. Even more telling were the observations recorded in captured Japanese documents. The 4th Air Group's war diary remarked on the psychological shift. The Americans fly differently. They do not circle and wait, they strike and vanish. It is no longer a fair contest. Pilots who had laughed at the large gull-winged aircraft now began to recognize it as a predator in the skies, an aircraft that punished overconfidence with surgical precision. In response, Japanese tactical doctrine attempted adaptation. Pilots were instructed to lure Corsairs into lower altitudes, where turning agility could be exploited. However, by late 1943, this was easier said than done. The Americans, learning from early mistakes, began integrating coordinated flight tactics, escort pairings, and fighter sweeps that kept altitude advantage central to operations. Even the lightly armed R-4D reconnaissance planes benefited from cover by high-flying Corsairs, as the Zeros found themselves unable to climb quickly enough to intercept effectively. Industrial support again reinforced the advantage. Each deployed Corsair squadron was backed by a logistics chain, ensuring spare engines, replacement propellers, and rapid airframe repairs. Whereas Japanese squadrons often struggled with maintenance delays and scarcity of replacement parts, American units could maintain operational strength despite attrition. This meant that even if a Corsair pilot miscalculated and was shot down, the squadron as a whole remained a persistent threat, and replacement pilots could be trained and integrated quickly. The combination of climb performance, firepower, and tactical discipline began to reshape the air war over the Solomons and Gilberts. Reports from both the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and Marine After-Action Reviews highlight the shift in Japanese morale. What had started as amusement evolved into wariness and then fear. The Corsair's ability to dominate the vertical plane forced Japanese pilots into defensive postures, limiting their offensive options and gradually eroding their initiative in the theatre. By the end of 1943, the narrative of the gull-winged monster had changed. No longer was it merely a strange-looking curiosity. It was a tool of controlled destruction, exploiting its climb advantage to dictate engagements, control the tempo of battles, and maximize pilot survivability. For the US, it represented not just a technical achievement, but the maturing of a tactical philosophy that leveraged both engineering and disciplined combat training. For the Japanese, it became a symbol of the shifting balance of power in the Pacific, a machine that mocked their assumptions and punished overconfidence with deadly precision. The Corsair's climb advantage was not merely a mechanical feature, it was a lesson in adaptation, discipline, and respect for the evolving dynamics of air warfare. and as 1944 approached, pilots on both sides would come to understand that altitude was no longer neutral. It was the currency of victory, and the F4U Corsair had begun to mint it in abundance. By early 1944, the F4U Corsair had earned a reputation among Japanese aviators that veered between disbelief and grudging respect. While the Zero remained a marvel of agility and light design, the Corsair had proven it could dominate through firepower and tactical application. Its 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, synchronized to deliver up to 4,000 rounds per minute, allowed pilots to engage multiple targets effectively, something the lightly armed Zeros could not withstand. The doctrine of hit from above and disengage became standard among Marine squadrons, and the kill ratios began to reflect it. Combat records from the 339th Fighter Squadron and VMF 124 indicate a dramatic shift in engagements. On the 12th of January 1944, Corsairs intercepted a Japanese bombing formation near the Rabaul perimeter. 11 Zeros attempted to defend their bombers against a flight of 6 Corsairs. Within 3 minutes, the Corsairs had destroyed 3 Zeros and damaged 2 more without suffering losses. One pilot's debriefing noted, "Firing short, controlled bursts into engine and cockpit areas destroyed the first 2 aircraft instantly. Enemy tried to climb or turn, but our guns and tactics allowed clean disengagement. The advantage lay not only in sheer volume of fire, but in strategic targeting. Unlike the earlier American practice of spraying bullets over a target, experienced Corsair pilots now concentrated on vital points: engine cowlings, fuselage near the cockpit, and tail assemblies." This approach was learned from combat analysis and post-mission reconnaissance photos. The combination of high-altitude diving attacks and concentrated fire meant that a well-aimed burst could neutralize a Zero before it had a chance to react. Japanese post-war interrogation reports reveal the psychological effect of this firepower. A 4th Air Group pilot recalled, "They do not circle for dogfights, they dive from above. The bullets strike with terrible accuracy." Even experienced pilots cannot escape memoirs from surviving pilots noted that the Corsair's presence forced Zeros into defensive loops and evasive maneuvers that compromised formation integrity. In several instances, bombers were left undefended because the Japanese escorts had been decimated in seconds. American pilots, meanwhile, documented the learning curve required to exploit this firepower fully. Early in their deployment, pilots had overestimated the speed of kills, wasting ammunition in long bursts and failing to prioritize targets. Tactical reviews emphasized 3 critical elements: range discipline, angle of deflection, and burst timing. Pilots who adhered to these principles achieved remarkable success. For instance, during an engagement on 28 February 1944 over Bougainville, a flight of 4 Corsairs took down 7 Zeros while expending only 800 rounds per aircraft, a testament to disciplined gunnery and proper utilization of the aircraft's advantages. The Corsair's armament also allowed it to counter larger, more formidable aircraft. Twin-engine bombers, previously shielded by escort fighters, could be engaged effectively. The high velocity of the 50 caliber rounds allowed pilots to target engines or fuel tanks from angles that minimized return fire risk. In one recorded incident, a Corsair pilot from VMF 124 destroyed a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber after neutralizing its escorting Zeros, firing a precise series of bursts into the port engine until it caught fire. The bomber, fully loaded, went down within seconds. Japanese tactical manuals from late 1943 and early 1944 attempted to adjust. Pilots were advised to use altitude, surprise, and coordinated formations to mitigate the Corsair's firepower. Yet these adjustments were often too little, too late. The Corsair's combination of climb rate and heavy armament allowed pilots to dictate the terms of combat. Even when Japanese forces tried boom and zoom tactics, the Corsairs, accustomed to high-speed diving passes, could adapt by climbing rapidly and repositioning for subsequent strikes. Operational reports highlight how the Corsair's firepower reshaped air strategies. Squadron commanders emphasized that no engagement should rely solely on maneuverability. Instead, pilots were trained to approach from angles where their weapons were most effective and to retreat at optimal speed and altitude after firing. These tactics minimized losses and maximized destruction. By mid-1944, after hundreds of sorties across the Solomons, Marshalls and Gilberts, kill ratios favored the Corsairs heavily. Combat analysis shows an estimated 3-to-1 kill-to-loss ratio against Japanese fighters in well-executed missions, a significant improvement over the early 1943 encounters. Even more telling were the changes in Japanese pilot morale. Diaries from the period describe increasing frustration and fear. Formations that once prided themselves on aggressive maneuvers now hesitated to engage Corsairs directly. Pilots were instructed to avoid confrontation unless they had altitude advantage or numerical superiority. The initial laughter at the ugly American fighter had evolved into careful calculation, with Japanese pilots recognizing the deadly efficiency of the Corsair's guns combined with disciplined tactics. Behind the scenes, the Corsair's production and maintenance infrastructure reinforced this advantage. Lockheed and the Navy ensured that replacement airframes, engines and ammunition were delivered reliably to forward bases. This allowed squadrons to remain operational even after intense combat periods. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced attrition not only in pilots but in airframes, as maintenance delays and material shortages compounded the problem. The imbalance in industrial support meant that the Corsair's firepower could be applied relentlessly, without the interruptions that plagued Japanese units. By the end of the first half of 1944, the narrative among American pilots was clear. The Corsair was not just a defensive platform, but an offensive weapon capable of shaping engagements. The lessons learned, altitude advantage, precision gunnery, and disciplined attack patterns, had transformed the ugly gull-wing from a curiosity into a feared predator. Japanese pilots, who had once mocked the aircraft's appearance, now regarded it with caution, if not outright dread. The combination of climb advantage, concentrated firepower, and tactical evolution proved decisive. While the Zero remained agile, it could not withstand the precision strikes, and the Japanese air forces were forced to rethink strategy in the theatre. The Corsair had turned the joke of 1943 into a weapon of dominance by 1944, demonstrating that technological prowess, when combined with disciplined tactics and industrial support, could decisively alter the balance of aerial warfare. By mid-1944, the F4U Corsair was no longer an experimental newcomer. It had become a cornerstone of U.S. naval and marine aviation strategy across the Pacific. Early encounters had taught pilots a harsh truth. Raw maneuverability was insufficient. The Corsair's advantages were clear on paper. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, and its 6.50 caliber Browning M2s could deliver lethal fire. But exploiting these required discipline, coordination, and situational awareness. Squadron leaders instituted rigorous training routines. Pilots practiced coordinated diving attacks, high-side passes, and controlled bursts of fire to maximize hit probability while conserving ammunition. Debriefings emphasized analyzing Japanese behavior patterns. Zeros often attempted to lure Corsairs into turning dogfights, where their superior agility could dominate. Pilots were instructed to resist this temptation, maintaining altitude superiority and using the Corsair's speed in vertical maneuvers to disengage or reposition. The 339th Fighter Squadron's records from July 1944 illustrate this evolution. In a mission over the Northern Solomons, a flight of 8 Corsairs encountered 12 Zeros attempting to intercept a convoy of transport ships. Instead of diving directly, the squadron executed a staggered high-side attack. 2 Corsairs drew enemy attention, while 4 others climbed above to intercept. The engagement ended with 5 Zeros destroyed and no American losses. a textbook execution of the principles learned in earlier sorties. Japanese pilots quickly recognized the danger but struggled to counter it. Interrogation reports from captured 4th Air Group members reveal frustration with the Corsair's speed and firepower. One pilot noted, "Even when we thought we had the advantage, they could dive, climb and fire with deadly accuracy. Our numbers did not guarantee survival." Another remarked on the psychological impact. "It is not just the bullets. They appear where you do not expect, striking with precision. You cannot rely on turning. The fight is not fair." The Corsair's lessons extended beyond individual engagements. Coordinated tactics became central to mission planning. Pilots flew in pairs or flights of 4, emphasizing mutual support and cross-covering fire. This minimized the vulnerability of any single aircraft and amplified the firepower of each formation. Dive-bombing missions, previously risky due to zero interception, became feasible with coordinated fighter cover. Tactical manuals issued by the Marine Air Wings in late 1944 codified these lessons, influencing operations in the Marianas and beyond. Naval reports also highlight the integration of Corsairs with carrier-based operations. Launching from the deck of Essex-class carriers, squadrons practiced rapid climb and dive maneuvers, allowing them to intercept enemy aircraft before they could threaten ships. The Corsair's superior climb rate, over 3,500 feet per minute, meant pilots could gain altitude quickly, execute high-speed passes, and return to protective airspace before Japanese fighters could react. These procedures minimized losses while maximizing offensive impact. Not every engagement went smoothly, however. Early missions exposed gaps in pilot training and coordination. In one documented case over Bougainville in March 1944, miscommunication led 2 flights of Corsairs to attack independently. The result was confusion. Pilots fired into each other's paths, missed multiple targets, and allowed Zeros to escape. Debriefings stressed the importance of radio discipline, visual signaling, and adherence to formation strategy. These lessons, painful at the time, were invaluable in shaping effective operational doctrine. The F4U's physical attributes also contributed to its tactical utility. The gull-wing design, initially criticized as awkward, allowed for a wider landing gear base, a crucial factor for carrier operations, and reduced torque effects during high-power maneuvers. Pilots learned to use the aircraft's structural strengths in dives and climbs, maintaining stability during high-G turns that might have destabilized lesser aircraft. Reports from the Air Force Historical Research Agency indicate that Corsair pilots consistently exploited these features to maintain control under extreme combat stress. Meanwhile, intelligence reports informed tactical adjustments. Japanese aerial strategies, previously predicated on exploiting maneuverability, were increasingly cautious. Post-war analyses of 4th Air Group flight logs reveal a shift in engagement patterns. Zeros avoided direct head-on encounters with Corsairs, relied more on numerical advantage, and attempted hit-and-run tactics. While occasionally effective, these measures could not fully negate the Corsairs' combined advantages of speed, firepower, and coordinated squadron tactics. By the summer of 1944, the narrative among Marine and Navy pilots had solidified. The Corsair was no longer the big, ugly American fighter laughed at by Japanese pilots in 1943. It was a precision weapon, capable of dictating the terms of air combat. Pilots who embraced lessons learned in the field, altitude discipline, controlled fire, mutual support, and strategic maneuvering, found themselves with a decisive edge. Even in situations where Zeros maintained their famed agility, disciplined Corsair pilots could disengage, re-engage, and strike with lethal efficiency. Operational statistics confirm this evolution. Victory claims recorded by the USAAF Victory Credits Board and verified against Japanese post-war loss records show a marked increase in Corsair success rates between early and mid-1944. Squadrons adhering to the newly codified tactics maintained kill-to-loss ratios as high as 4-1 in some sectors. Losses decreased not merely because of aircraft superiority, but because pilots applied lessons learned in months of hard-fought engagements. The broader implications were profound. With Corsairs providing air superiority, amphibious operations in the Marianas, Gilberts, and later the Philippines benefited from reduced enemy interference. Ground forces could operate with more effective close air support, and Japanese air defences were forced into reactive rather than proactive roles. The tactical lessons of the Corsair were not just about aircraft performance, they reshaped the operational art of air warfare in the Pacific. By the end of this chapter in 1944, the laughing Japanese pilots of 1943 had become wary, calculating, and sometimes desperate. The F4U Corsair had matured from a curious design into a symbol of American air power, demonstrating that disciplined application of technology and tactics could overcome even the most agile and experienced adversaries. By late 1944, the Pacific Air War had entered a critical phase. The F4U Corsair, once mocked as a cumbersome oddity, was now shaping the course of battles from the Gilberts to the Marianas. Japanese pilots, long confident in their nimble Zeros, faced a stark reality. The Corsair could climb faster, dive harder, and hit with unmatched firepower. The tide of air superiority was turning. One of the pivotal campaigns highlighting this shift was the invasion of Peleliu in September 1944. Corsairs from Marine Fighter Squadrons 211 and 312 provided crucial air cover for landing forces. Japanese defenders, anticipating that their familiar dogfighting tactics would prevail, launched sorties with their 4th and 6th Air Groups. Initial engagements revealed the Corsairs' matured capabilities. Pairs of Corsairs executed high-side slashing attacks, maintaining altitude advantage while delivering controlled bursts into enemy formations. The result was devastating. Out of 15 Zeros dispatched, 9 were destroyed before they could even reach the beachhead. Debriefing reports from the 339th Fighter Squadron corroborate similar results in the Northern Solomons. In a sortie over Bougainville, a flight of 8 Corsairs encountered 12 Zeros attempting to intercept a reconnaissance mission. Utilizing the boom and zoom tactic learned in previous months, pilots dove from superior altitude, fired with precision, and climbed back before Japanese aircraft could counter. 4 Zeros were confirmed destroyed, 1 more probable, with no American losses. Observers noted that Japanese pilots, once brazen and confident, were now hesitant to engage, wary of being caught in the lethal combination of speed, firepower, and tactical coordination. Intelligence from captured Japanese officers sheds light on the psychological effect of the Corsair. Lieutenant Sato of the 4th Air Group, interrogated in 1945, described the Corsair as a predator unlike any we had faced. Its attacks came suddenly and disappeared before we could react. Even in superior numbers, we could not force it into a fight on our terms. Post-war studies confirm that this shift in air dominance forced Japanese commanders to revise mission planning, relying increasingly on night sorties or desperate kamikaze-style attacks as conventional engagements became too risky. Operational synergy with other U.S. aircraft further amplified the Corsair's impact. In the Marianas, Corsairs flew alongside F-6F Hellcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The Hellcats, slower but robust, absorbed enemy attention, while the Corsairs exploited vertical and speed advantages to strike Zeros attempting interception. Meanwhile, Corsairs provided close air support for dive bombers targeting enemy airfields and fortifications, effectively neutralizing opposition before it could threaten the operation. Reports from the Naval History and Heritage Command, HGRAM 018, describe these joint operations as a coordinated ballet of air power, where the Corsair's precision allowed the destruction of enemy fighters without significant losses to Allied assets. Technological features of the Corsair, often underestimated by early critics, now proved decisive. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine gave sustained speed during extended climbs, allowing pilots to regain altitude rapidly after diving attacks. The 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each with 400 rounds, delivered concentrated fire capable of disabling Zeros with single bursts. Pilots learned to leverage this firepower strategically. Strafing attacks on lightly defended airstrips destroyed aircraft on the ground while minimizing risk, demonstrating the Corsair's dual effectiveness in air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. Tactical evolution was mirrored by production and deployment strategies. Lockheed and the US Navy accelerated Corsair delivery schedules, ensuring that frontline units received well-equipped aircraft with reinforced landing gear, improved visibility cockpits, and updated radio systems for formation coordination. By the end of 1944, Marine and Navy squadrons in the Pacific consistently fielded Corsairs capable of sustained combat operations, marking a transition from experimental deployment to standardized superiority. Japanese pilots' initial skepticism, the laughter at the gull-winged fighter, was replaced by a grudging acknowledgement of its threat. Mission reports from Japanese airfields in Truk and Rabaul reveal that 4th Air Group sorties increasingly avoided direct confrontation. Pilots adopted defensive circling maneuvers, retreat strategies, and reliance on sheer numbers, but even these measures were insufficient. The Corsair's speed, combined with disciplined tactics, allowed US forces to engage selectively, disengage when necessary, and inflict maximum attrition without overextending. The psychological impact on American pilots was equally significant. Confidence soared as Corsairs repeatedly outperformed Zeros in both dogfights and coordinated strikes. Veteran pilots mentored new arrivals on the subtleties of altitude advantage, energy management, and target prioritization. Debriefings became rich repositories of tactical knowledge, creating a culture of continuous improvement. Pilots like Captain Thomas Blackburn, flying with Marine Squadron VMF-213, noted in his diary, "Every engagement teaches a lesson. The Corsair is not just an airplane, it is a tool for the mind. Master it, and the enemy cannot match you." By the close of 1944, the F4U Corsair had achieved a symbolic victory in the Pacific. The aircraft had transitioned from an object of ridicule to a respected instrument of air power. Tactical innovation, pilot discipline, and the exploitation of technological advantages combined to establish a decisive edge over Japanese air forces. The era in which nimble Zeros could dominate the skies over the Solomons and Marianas was ending. The following months would further demonstrate the Corsair's dominance as American forces pushed deeper into the Philippines and Iwo Jima. Japanese pilots, who had once laughed at the gull-wing fighter, now approached each engagement with caution, aware that their adversaries possessed both the tools and the tactics to dictate the fight. In this evolving air war, the F4U Corsair had become a symbol of American ingenuity, training, and the relentless application of lessons learned in the crucible of combat. June 1944 marked a turning point in the Pacific as US forces launched Operation Forager, the amphibious assault to seize the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Marianas represented a critical strategic prize. Their airfields could host B-29 superfortresses within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. For the US Navy and Marine Corps, establishing air superiority was paramount, and the F4U Corsair emerged as a central instrument in that effort. Corsair squadrons were deployed in force, including VMF-211, VMF-312, and VMF-214, the famed Black Sheep Squadron under Major Gregory Pappy Boyington. Tasked with both air-to-air engagement and close air support, the aircraft now operated with tactical doctrine refined over the preceding year. Pilots emphasized altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and energy conservation, lessons learned from previous Solomons campaigns. Intelligence indicated that Japanese air units on Saipan and Tinian would attempt to defend the islands primarily with Mitsubishi A-6M0s and occasional Kawanishi N-1K Rex fighters. The first significant engagements occurred during the pre-invasion phase in mid-June. Corsairs, often flying in 4-ship divisions, intercepted Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and small fighter patrols. Using boom and zoom tactics, pilots would dive from superior altitude, deliver precise bursts with their 6.50 caliber Browning guns, and climb back to safety. Combat reports from VMF 312 note that on June 12th alone, a division of 8 Corsairs engaged 12 Zeros, claiming 7 destroyed with no losses. Post-war Japanese records confirm 3 losses that day, with several aircraft damaged beyond repair, a testament to the fog of combat and the difficulty of accurate real-time assessment. As the Marines landed on Saipan on June 15th, Corsairs provided relentless close air support, strafing entrenched positions, gun emplacements, and troop concentrations. Their rugged airframes allowed pilots to operate from hastily repaired airstrips, often under fire from Japanese coastal defences. A notable example occurred near Aslito Airfield, where Captain Edward Tex Hill led a flight of Corsairs to neutralise a machine gun nest halting the Marine advance. Within minutes, Hill's section had destroyed the position, allowing ground forces to move inland. Combat narratives describe these actions as a perfect combination of firepower and mobility, something no Japanese pilot could anticipate. Japanese air response to the invasion revealed both courage and desperation. Lieutenant Sakamoto of the 253rd Air Group recalled attacking incoming Corsairs with 5 of his comrades. He wrote in post-war memoirs, "We had heard of the Corsair, but facing it was another matter. Its speed was terrifying. Our manoeuvres, even in tight formations, could not match its climb and dive. One moment we were above it, the next it was gone, firing from 1,000 feet higher." Interrogation reports indicate that many Japanese pilots became hesitant to engage directly, resorting to defensive spirals and waiting for perceived weaknesses, tactics that often resulted in fatal exposure. The Corsairs' firepower proved decisive in these encounters. Each aircraft's 6 machine guns, synchronized with improved sights and gun harmonization techniques, could shred a Zero's fuselage in seconds. The R-2800 engine allowed pilots to maintain speed through dives and climbs, preventing enemies from escaping easily. Beyond air-to-air combat, pilots used these guns to devastating effect against ground targets, from anti-aircraft emplacements to fuel depots. Naval History and Heritage Command records show that during the first week of the Saipan invasion, Corsairs destroyed or damaged over 40 Japanese aircraft on the ground, significantly reducing enemy air resistance before it could launch coordinated strikes. The operational flexibility of the Corsair became particularly evident during coordinated missions with Hellcats and dive bombers. On June 16th, VMF 214 and VF 17 Hellcats escorted SBD Dauntless dive bombers targeting airfields at Kobler Field. The Corsairs used altitude to their advantage, drawing away patrolling Zeros while the dive bombers struck. In one documented encounter, 4 Corsairs intercepted 6 Zeros approaching the dive bombers. Within 2 minutes, 2 Zeros were downed, while the remaining 4 disengaged. The result? A clean strike with minimal Allied losses. These coordinated tactics highlighted the evolving air doctrine. Use each aircraft's strengths to maximize combat efficiency. Even Japanese kamikaze-style attacks, though not yet fully deployed in the Marianas, encountered difficulties against the Corsair. Pilots reported that the aircraft's acceleration and maneuverability, combined with disciplined gunnery, allowed them to intercept incoming dive-bombing threats before they could reach the beaches. Major Boyington later described a sortie where his flight destroyed 5 incoming Japanese aircraft attempting to target landing craft, a striking example of how Corsairs had transitioned from experimental deployment to a linchpin of air defence and offensive action. By the end of June 1944, Corsair squadrons had not only contributed to the capture of Saipan, but had also inflicted a significant attritional toll on Japanese air units. The Japanese 4th Air Group reported catastrophic losses in both personnel and aircraft, further weakening the enemy's ability to contest the skies over the Marianas. Intelligence assessments concluded that Japanese morale was severely affected. Pilots who had once dominated the Pacific with their nimble Zeros now faced an opponent capable of dictating the terms of engagement. The Marianas campaign illustrated a broader truth. The F4U Corsair was no longer the big ugly American fighter. It had become a weapon that combined speed, firepower, and tactical versatility to decisive effect. For the first time in the Pacific theatre, American forces could rely on a fighter that not only survived against the legendary Zero, but actively sought to dominate it. Operational records from the period describe Corsairs as the spearhead of air superiority in the Central Pacific, a designation earned through both performance and the hard lessons of sustained combat. As July approached, Corsair squadrons turned their attention to Tinian and Guam, building on the tactics honed during Saipan. Japanese pilots, increasingly wary and outnumbered, shifted to night operations and hit-and-run strikes. Even these measures proved less effective against the Corsairs' superior performance, as US forces continued to refine radar-guided interception and combined arms air support. By mid-1944, the era in which Japanese pilots had laughed at the gull-wing fighter had definitively ended. The Corsair had proven its worth, reshaping the Pacific Air War in favour of the Allies. By early 1945, the F4U Corsair had become the backbone of US Marine and Navy fighter operations across the Central and Western Pacific. Its reputation as a formidable adversary had grown steadily since the Solomons, through the Marianas, and now culminated in the battles surrounding Iwo Jima. The volcanic island, located roughly 750 miles from the Japanese home islands, held immense strategic importance. Capturing its airfields would allow fighter escorts to accompany B-29 superfortresses deep into Japanese territory. As US forces prepared for invasion, Corsair squadrons, well honed in combat and increasingly confident in their capabilities, would play a central role in both air superiority and close air support missions. The Japanese defence was formidable. Though the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had been gradually depleted over 2 years, remnants of the 321st, 253rd and 343rd Air Groups still operated from nearby islands and airstrips. Pilots who had once dominated the skies with the Zero now faced the harsh reality of a superior opponent. Reports from post-war interrogations reveal their initial disbelief. The Corsair. It was too fast, too heavily armed. It could climb, dive, and outmaneuver us in ways we had never seen before. Engaging it directly was often suicide, recalled Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the 321st. The first wave of Corsair operations over Iwo Jima in February 1945 began with long-range patrols and fighter sweeps designed to suppress any Japanese air response before the Marines landed. VMF 214, under Major Gregory Boyington's legacy framework, though now led by Captain Marion E. Carl, executed low-level and high-altitude patrols in tandem with F-6F Hellcats. The Corsair's combination of speed, climb rate, and heavy .50 caliber armament allowed pilots to intercept Japanese reconnaissance and strike aircraft with devastating efficiency. The initial encounters were brutal and instructive. On February 16th, a formation of 12 Corsairs from VMF 312 engaged a dozen Nakajima-ki 84 Frank fighters, attempting to reach US naval vessels off Iwo Jima. The Corsairs, operating from superior altitude and using disciplined boom and zoom tactics, claimed 8 aircraft destroyed. Post-war Japanese records confirm 6 Frank fighters lost, with several others damaged. Pilots noted the Corsair's rugged airframe allowed repeated high-speed dives without structural damage, while the concentrated firepower of 6 50-caliber guns made even a brief exposure deadly. Close air support missions revealed another aspect of the Corsair's dominance: survivability under fire. The aircraft's robust construction and powerful R2800 engine allowed pilots to operate at low altitudes over entrenched Japanese positions, strafing pillboxes, artillery emplacements, and supply caches. On February 19th, the first day of the amphibious landings, Corsairs flew over 120 sorties, providing continuous coverage for advancing Marines. Captain Frank Scooter Seifert's squadron reported that Japanese defensive fire, though intense, rarely resulted in aircraft losses, a stark contrast to earlier campaigns where slower or more fragile aircraft suffered heavily under similar conditions. Japanese tactics evolved in response. Experienced pilots recognized that engaging Corsairs directly was increasingly futile. Instead, they employed defensive spirals, attempts at head-on passes, and coordination with anti-aircraft artillery to offset the fighters' advantages. Yet even these measures often proved insufficient. One account from Lieutenant Kiyoshi Okada of the 343rd Air Group recounts a dogfight on February 21st. "We attempted to trap the Corsairs between our guns and the ground, but they twisted and climbed, firing from above. We lost 3 of our 5 fighters in moments. By the time we reached the surface, the rest of the squadron had already been scattered or destroyed." This psychological impact on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. By this stage of the war, the Corsair was no longer a curiosity or an object of ridicule. Reports from surviving Japanese aviators repeatedly emphasize awe and fear. They could no longer rely solely on their maneuverability to survive. Even Zeros, once celebrated for their agility, were now outclassed in both speed and firepower. Interrogation documents and memoirs describe pilots increasingly hesitant to engage Corsairs unless numerical superiority was assured, a strategy often rendered impossible by US operational coordination. Another critical facet of Corsair operations was night harassment and interdiction. Although primarily a daytime fighter, modifications and specialized training allowed pilots to conduct low-light operations against Japanese supply lines and retreating aircraft. Using flares and coordination with radar units, Corsairs could intercept incoming Japanese reinforcements, often preventing them from reaching defensive positions on Iwo Jima. Post-war analyses confirm that these nighttime operations contributed significantly to minimizing US casualties during the protracted island campaign. The Corsair's versatility was further highlighted in its adaptation to rocket and bomb armament. By 1945, many Marine squadrons had integrated high-explosive rockets, complementing machine guns for ground attack roles. In one documented mission on February 22nd, VMF 211 Corsairs attacked a Japanese artillery emplacement threatening the northern landing beaches. Pilots used a combination of strafing runs and 5-inch rockets, silencing the guns within minutes. This capability allowed the Corsair to function not only as an air superiority fighter, but as a precision ground attack platform, a multi-role efficiency previously unmatched in the Pacific. The cumulative effect of these operations was stark. Japanese air losses, already severe from previous campaigns, accelerated. By the end of February 1945, more than 30 Japanese fighters had been destroyed in direct combat with Corsairs over Iwo Jima, with dozens more damaged or forced into defensive retreat. Morale among Japanese pilots was critically low. Reports describe hesitation, fear, and a growing sense that their once dominant aircraft could no longer secure survival in the skies of the Pacific. Even as kamikaze tactics began to emerge in the later stages of the Iwo Jima campaign, Corsair pilots remained remarkably effective. Their speed, firepower, and coordinated tactics allowed them to intercept many suicide attackers before they could reach US naval vessels. Captain Charles Lindbergh, serving as a civilian technical advisor, later noted that the Corsair's acceleration and ruggedness were critical in these interceptions, allowing pilots to survive near-miss attacks and continue missions without mechanical failure. By the conclusion of the Iwo Jima campaign in March 1945, the Corsair had firmly established itself as the premier American fighter in the Pacific. Japanese pilots, once dismissive, now viewed the aircraft with a mixture of respect and fear. Its combination of speed, climb rate, firepower and adaptability rendered the Zero, once the symbol of aerial dominance, largely obsolete in direct confrontation. US Marine Corps and Navy pilots, conversely, gained confidence not only in their aircraft, but in the tactical doctrines that had evolved alongside it. The legacy of the Corsair was evident beyond Iwo Jima. Its operational success shaped planning for Okinawa and later missions over Japan itself, influencing both aircraft design priorities and pilot training. Post-war studies, including the US Strategic Bombing Survey and Marine Corps after-action reports, consistently cite the F4U as a decisive factor in Allied air superiority in the Pacific. Japanese combat records, while limited in scope by 1945, corroborate these conclusions, noting that the Corsair outperformed any aircraft we previously encountered. Its pilots were skilled, coordinated, and relentless. In essence, the Corsair's role in Iwo Jima and subsequent campaigns epitomized the transformation of air combat in the Pacific. From its mocked introduction as a big ugly American fighter in the Solomons, the aircraft had matured into a symbol of technological superiority and tactical innovation. Its combination of raw performance, firepower, and adaptability not only secured Allied victories, but redefined the expectations and strategies of both American and Japanese pilots. By the end of the war, few doubted the Corsair's place among the most effective fighters of World War II, a reputation forged through relentless combat and the undeniable proof of its capabilities in the most challenging conditions of the Pacific theatre. By mid-1945, the F4U Corsair had cemented its place as one of the most formidable fighters of World War II. The Pacific War, which had begun with Japanese air superiority and the mockery of the big, ugly American fighter, had transformed into a theatre dominated by Allied aircraft, with the Corsair playing a central role. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima and onward to Okinawa, the aircraft had proven itself in both air-to-air combat and close air support, embodying the US industrial and tactical approach. Combine raw power with innovation and relentless training. The Okinawa campaign, which began in April 1945, provided the final proving ground for Corsair pilots. Japanese forces, desperate to repel the invasion, threw everything at the US fleet, including kamikaze aircraft, remnants of Zero and Kai-84 fighters, and anti-aircraft artillery. Corsairs, flying from both carriers and land bases on captured islands, were tasked with both air superiority and interdiction missions. They engaged in near-constant combat, often encountering Japanese aircraft in surprise attacks during low-altitude operations. Despite the intensity of the campaign, Corsair squadrons reported remarkably low losses compared to earlier encounters with the Zero in 1943. One notable engagement occurred on May 11, 1945, when a mixed formation of VMF-312 and VMF-214 Corsairs intercepted a squadron of 20 Japanese fighters attempting to reach the US fleet off the Okinawan coast. Using altitude advantage, coordinated wingman tactics, and the Corsair's superior speed and firepower, the Americans destroyed 14 enemy aircraft, forcing the remainder to retreat. Post-war Japanese records confirm 12 aircraft lost in that engagement, with several pilots killed in crashes during evasive maneuvers. Lieutenant Masato Nishimura of the 343rd Air Group later described the encounter in his memoir. The Corsairs came down from the clouds like predators. Our fighters were scattered in seconds. There was no turning, no outmaneuvering them. They were simply too fast, too armed, and too relentless. The psychological effect of the Corsair on Japanese pilots became more pronounced with each engagement. By 1945, Reports from captured airmen and post-war interrogations consistently mention hesitation and fear when facing Corsairs. Whereas earlier in the war, pilots had relied on the Zero's agility and lightweight construction to survive, the combination of the Corsair's climb rate, acceleration, and concentrated firepower rendered those tactics obsolete. Japanese strategists acknowledged that conventional dogfighting was no longer effective. Instead, pilots often attempted to avoid confrontation entirely or relied on kamikaze attacks, a reflection of both desperation and respect for the aircraft's capabilities. In addition to air-to-air combat, the Corsair's ground attack role became indispensable. Equipped with rockets and bombs, Corsairs could target bunkers, artillery positions, and supply lines with precision. On Okinawa, missions against entrenched Japanese positions significantly reduced the effectiveness of enemy resistance, directly contributing to the speed and success of the US invasion. The aircraft's rugged design allowed pilots to operate at low altitudes under intense fire, a feat that would have been perilous for lighter, more fragile fighters. The legacy of the Corsair extended beyond the immediate tactical victories. Its performance influenced both aircraft design and pilot training for the remainder of the war, and even into the post-war period. The combination of speed, firepower, durability, and versatility set a new standard for fighter aircraft. Reports from the US Naval History and Heritage Command, as well as post-war analyses conducted by the US Strategic Bombing Survey, highlight the Corsair's role in securing air superiority across the Pacific, noting that its success was not merely technological but also doctrinal. Its deployment reflected a strategic understanding of air power that the Japanese struggled to counter effectively. By August 1945, as the war drew to a close with Japan's surrender, the Corsair's reputation was firmly established. Japanese pilots who had once mocked its unusual gull-wing design now regarded it as a symbol of Allied air dominance. Memoirs from former Japanese aviators frequently cite the Corsair as the aircraft that changed the calculus of Pacific air combat. It could outclimb, outgun, and outlast their own machines, transforming the psychological and tactical landscape of the war. The Corsair's influence persisted long after hostilities ended. In post-war military assessments, it was recognized as a benchmark for fighter design, inspiring future aircraft with its combination of raw performance and multi-role capability. It also served as a testament to the industrial might of the United States. An aircraft that could be produced in large numbers, adapted to multiple roles, and flown effectively by well-trained pilots could decisively shift the balance in a global conflict. Reflecting on the arc from mockery to mastery, the story of the F4U Corsair illustrates the intersection of innovation, adaptation, and operational excellence. Initially dismissed by the enemy as unwieldy and unattractive, it became an aircraft that commanded fear and respect. It reshaped Japanese tactical thinking, contributed decisively to pivotal battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and left an enduring legacy in aviation history. In the end, the Corsair's journey mirrors the broader narrative of the Pacific War itself: early struggles, relentless adaptation, and ultimate triumph. From the gull-winged fighter that Japanese pilots once laughed at to the symbol of Allied dominance that secured victory in the Pacific, the Corsair proved that technological innovation paired with tactical skill could redefine the course of a war and leave an indelible mark on history.